So for me, it was a very slow process that I meandered to it through what I was doing, because the number one reason that a short-term rental contract is ripped up, in my experience, is because a bad guest gets in and significant damage happens. And that's no good to anyone.
Property management at scale is about more than just rent rolls and maintenance calls. It's about protecting your assets, delivering stellar guest experiences, and scaling operations without losing quality. Welcome to Minute by Minute, a show where industry leaders share unfiltered stories, proven strategies, and real solutions for operating at scale. I'm your host, Nils Mattisson, CEO of Minut, and together we will dive deep into what it really takes to keep your properties safe, efficient, and protected. Let's get started. Today we're thrilled to welcome Leo. Leo, you're a true industry veteran, a thought leader in the short-term rental space. You're a co-founder of Truvi, which some of you might remember as Superhog before a successful rebrand this year, which is a global platform for risk management and trust verification in the short-term rental industry. Before launching Truvi, you helped scale One Fine Stay, which is, of course, one of the earliest tech-enabled home-sharing companies. And there you honed your skills in guest experience, operations, hospitality, innovation. And now you also serve as Vice Chair at STAA, which has saved our bacon. And there you work closely with policymakers, operators, technology providers, and you help drive sustainable growth and regulatory collaboration across the sector. So in this conversation, we'll try to unpack how the industry has changed, with what proactive risk management looks like, particularly at scale, how operators can prepare for the next era of short-term rentals, and how it touches on guest safety, guest experience, and profitability. All of these things must be balanced. And it's such a pleasure to have you. So thank you so much for being our first guest on this podcast.
Very well. I'm honoured to be your first guest. What a privilege. Yeah, thank you for inviting me in. Life is good. I'm running around central London, which is a bit of a throwback to my former One Fine Stay days that I'm sure we'll get into. But yeah, enjoying being in town. I'm not in town as much as I used to be in this sort of hybrid working era that we're in. But yeah, it's nice. It's always good to see you, my friend.
Likewise. I'm happy you're taking the time when you're in London. And I think last time you were here, we also ran around London. So, I'm happy we're sitting down for this conversation now.
It's a theme, isn't it? We actually catch up running more than we catch up sort of sitting. So this is new for us. Let's see what the sort of conversation this inspires.
Yeah, we'll see. I'll probably get a few more words in. But let's start with your journey, Leo. You weren't good enough to become a professional football player, but you tried. And you later were in the restaurant industry before you sort of found your path into short-term rentals. What was it that drew you to this industry in particular?
Yeah, so thank you for reminding everyone that I was not good enough to play for Manchester United, my beloved Manchester United, although I certainly tried as a young player. I think when you realise that you're at the sort of middle to lower part of the ability in a local village team, you realise that going on to represent your city is probably a fantasy. So yeah, I pivoted quite quickly from that. From a very young age, from around the age of 13, 14, I was washing pots and waiting tables in a restaurant, in a seafood restaurant. And that experience ingrained in me a real love of being in customer service. Why did I love it? I worked with my brother as well. He was in the restaurant alongside me. Why did we love it? Was because we realized that the more we smiled, the more we tried to sort of charm people, the more pounds came out of their pockets and into our tip jar, which as a young person was fantastic, and, paid for a holiday as I got a bit older and helped get me on my way to go to university and things like that. So it was all about this idea of being in service to somebody that I found really, really appealing. And I'd always done hospitality-related jobs then as a student. And then when I first moved to London, to make ends meet, I got a job at a restaurant in Farringdon that was owned by at the time, Mr. MasterChef, John Turode. So I worked for him for a couple of years, really enjoyed being on my feet, loved it, and didn't want to take a corporate job necessarily because I enjoyed that idea of being in hospitality. So that's where I got really excited when I saw the advert for what One Fine Stay were trying to do, which was quite vague, but it's this idea of, can we turn central London properties into holiday homes for tourists? But the difference was, from the traditional RBO market, was that it was people's first homes. In the most part, it wasn't second property. Now, of course, it was second properties too, but it was people going, okay, I'm out of town for a few weeks. How can I make some money from my home? And what I think appealed to me was this idea that I could have a grown-up job in a very fun industry. And we can't forget that yes, we do very important, serious things, all of us, but we're essentially trying to help put the smile on people's faces when they go on holiday. You're doing it, I'm doing it, even though we're very far removed from it. And so I obviously never try and lose sight of that, because I think that's what makes our industry very, very cool. And again, I always say, if I could have my time over, I would do it all exactly the same way, because for me, all roads were leading into being a sort of hospitality SaaS provider in some way, shape or form.
I love how deliberate you were in seeking out this industry, because my journey, of course, is quite different. I started on the tech side, and before starting Minut, I had more this idea around how you could balance monitoring and privacy, which was something you could apply in many different industries. And it's a little bit by accident that Airbnb and short-term rentals was the place where we really started getting traction and we were sucked into it. But I'm so grateful for it, because it is a great industry. Like, people are happy, people are friendly. It's not very competitive, actually, because you have a lot of property managers who are working alongside with sort of the same types of issues. And I think as a result, it's very collaborative. And considering how much time when you're working, especially maybe in a startup, like how important that community is, I think more people should be deliberate about seeking out an industry that they really like, rather than maybe exactly what it is they're doing. So I love that you were doing that from a very early age.
I think there's something in that. I love that idea as well about collaboration. I feel that because there are very few national, international short-term rental brands, there are lots of software companies that are global, but there are less operators that are global. There is this ability to share best practice with each other, and it does create, if you're the sort of person who likes to go to an event and listen more than they talk. I have a reputation for being a talker, obviously, but I also, when I go to something like VRMA or VRWS, I'm there to listen to the pain points that people are suffering with. It does really allow for this idea that the rising tide can lift all ships. And I find that very inspiring, because it's great to be part of a team that's, again, I think our ultimate goal should be the reduction of issues, the reduction of low satisfaction scores for guests. It's how do we do that? How do we create hotel-style service in rooms and properties that are spread across a wide area? That is, I think, our distilled challenge that we should all collectively try and solve, and we're all trying to help with. And it's a very exciting challenge to try and solve, I think. Yeah,
and I think it's one of those where technology so obviously has enabled it. Like, of course, like hospitality is one of the oldest industries, and what is different now is that you can use software, you can use AI to run these distributed companies, and you can coordinate a team, and you can make sure that you have that 5-star guest experience. But you're one of the real veterans of this industry. Like, how would you say it has evolved over the decade plus that you've been working in it?
I think, first of all, primarily the traditional rent by owner market has met the tech-enabled home sharing market. A further convergence of that would be home swapping. So, we've all seen the rise of that, I think, in especially heavily regulated areas, namely New York City, but others where things like Airbnb have a bad reputation, and something like a home swapping platform comes in and almost solves that problem, but doesn't solve that problem. So that convergence is really, really interesting. And it puts someone who might be in a traditional vacation rental market in South Carolina and has always used platforms that maybe even allow them to take the direct booking themselves, but just send them the marketing lead. It brought them into this tech-enabled space where it was all about instant book and the fact that you had to be listing on multiple channels. And as a consequence of that convergence, you're also seeing the problems that people are experiencing being highlighted at a global level. And depending on what your market is, you might see a nuanced version of those problems. So you might be in a spring break market, so your problem is young people coming and trashing your property. You might be in an urban centre, so your problem might be fraud, drugs, things of that nature. But essentially all of those problems have come to the fore and people are talking about them collectively. So definitely, I wouldn't say it's necessarily homogenized the industry. I don't think you can ever homogenize short-term rentals, vacation rentals. That's the beauty of it. But certainly how people act as operators, I've seen hugely come together. And an example of that would be when we, and I was part of one of the very early team at One Fine Stay. At the time, One Fine Stay was trying to do distribution on its own without using OTAs, but also operating. So it was doing the full spectrum. And at that point, it wasn't necessarily inevitable that One Fine Stay listings would end up on Airbnb or syndicated throughout the OTA landscape. It was not inevitable, because at that point, people were building their websites, trying to build their businesses in their own way. And again, now it would seem ludicrous to start a property management business without being on Airbnb, without being on Vrbo, without being on Booking.com. That wasn't necessarily the case. So again, I've certainly seen it come together in that respect.
Looking at this sort of from a distribution perspective, you're going to get relatively few players that has the ear and the attention of travelers worldwide. But then you have the property managers where the demand, if you will, from a guest is to work with someone local, right? Like you're going somewhere and especially seeking out like an Airbnb or a short-term rental in order to get the local flavor. How do you pair up these two where you want to sort of be a local player, but now you actually have to find your guests on a pretty global playing field, and you might be maybe competing with players that are offering a similar experience, but maybe even in another market? Like how has that evolved?
It's a really good point. It's how our industry differs again from the hotel space. So obviously, you know, when a hotel flag builds a new hotel or works with a partner to open a new hotel, a franchise model, there is a level of similarity to one they've opened 100 miles away or 200 miles away or 1,000 miles away. Supply remains a very, very, very local game in our industry, and I think it will do for the foreseeable future. It makes you, I think, as an operator, it should make you think local first. So what can I do to pull in the best of my neighborhood, be that in how I style a property, the type of guests I'm focused on, the things I'm recommending that they do when they're in market. The people that do that best also then have a very healthy direct booking website. I don't know what healthy looks like, it depends on your market, where they're able to get repeat guests that come locally, or even get contractors and tradespeople that work in their area to fill in the void periods during shoulder season and slower season. So I think you have to think local first as a property manager. So what's in my area? What am I dealing with? Because, for example, if you don't think local first, I'll go back to that example. If you're in a spring break market, I wouldn't recommend putting a hot tub in your property. If you're in a forest in the middle of the UK, it might be quite nice to have a hot tub, and that might attract the type of guest you want. So as you're building out your guest avatar, you have to start by thinking, why is it that people are coming? What are they coming for? And then you can start to distribute on all of the global platforms, because you then might be pulling in additional guests that you didn't even think would want to come to your part of the world. As a separate point, we talk obsessively about someone wanting to come to your neighborhood. But we also know that lots of buying journeys start with somebody falling in love with a property, not necessarily knowing which part of outer London they want to go to with their friends that weekend. So how do you make sure it's your property they choose? Well, that's amenities, that's styling. So it's also thinking slightly beyond, this is the guest I know I can get based on my location, but it's building something that is aspirational to the guest that you're trying to attract. And that's very interesting, because I don't think, again, let's make the hotel comparison. You have to have a very, very sought after bougie hotel to bring someone into a certain part of the world just to stay at that hotel. Hotels are much more, I'm here for a couple of days, I'm there for a couple of days, I'm in Milan, I'm going to go and stay here. Short-term rentals, I think more than hotels, have the ability with something really special to get people together and pull them into the town they weren't necessarily looking at when they started. They started the buying journey.
I think the hotel comparison is very interesting, because you are seeing different developments in different sort of hotel groups or hotel chains where a hotel group is not one or two brands anymore. It's 50 brands with set up to cater to different type of travelers. And of course, you have the type of hotels that puts a special pride in making it so that a guest will feel exactly the same, whether they are in an airport hotel or whether they are going somewhere. Like, you want to have the experience of being almost in the same room, so that people who are business travelers and who are on the road frequently can get like a proper rest at the end of the day. But that's not what you want for your holiday, right? And I think this sort of very global distribution of very local properties, it has sort of fed a demand for this type of travel that maybe some communities have sort of struggled to meet. And so you're seeing some communities in the UK, for example, in Edinburgh or in St. Ives in Cornwall, where there is such a demand for that particular experience that it becomes almost difficult for the community to host it. Like, how do you see that in balance? And like, what can the industry do to sort of help people find those secondary communities that aren't always at the top of the list?
Yeah, it's a really good point. The how to fight over tourism, right? So we know that guests are not going everywhere, or else we wouldn't have that problem in the first place, right? So how do we draw people away from Edinburgh in August? Now, the truth is, Edinburgh Council probably still wants those guests coming in August because they've got their festivals on, and so it's about sensible policy decisions. That's the first thing, and then we can go out from there. But if we start at sensible policy decisions, I'm definitely not against certain local areas deciding that they need to assess how many short-term rentals they have in a certain area to make sure that there is not streets being completely overrun and you can't park, because then it kind of ruins the attraction for everybody. So I think having that sensible policy making there, coupled with a really smart local campaign around different towns, and I'll go into one or two that I think have done it really well. Let me say the really boring bit first, but I'm not just going to stop at the cliche, which is we need more money invested in local direct marketing organizations. So visit this beach town, visit this coastal community, visit this urban area, because it's been decimated. And in the US, they're much better at sort of putting money into having direct marketing organizations for their towns, for their beach towns. But you as a property manager, of course, can tell that story through social media, through video content that you can either have done professionally or yourself. You know, there is ways to bring people in, but we have to, I think, go back to this local point. We have to be very involved in our local towns and make sure that we're in tourism conversation is being had in the right way, because there are some wonderful places in the UK. You're right, St. Ives and Cornwall sells itself. So maybe they want to think about a cap because they want to limit visitor numbers, just like Venice have limited visitor numbers. But then Treviso, which is 20 minutes from Venice on the train, shouldn't have a cap and probably doesn't want to have a cap. So we need to be able to give local areas the freedom to make the decision that's right for them. A good example would be the mayor of Porto, who allows short-term rental licenses only in areas that need economic development. So then you build the short-term rentals, or you convert the short-term rentals. What happens next? The cafes, the restaurants, the people, the charm. People see what's beautiful about that area of Porto, and then at some point they might go, do you know what? I think we've got enough short-term rentals here. We're gonna close that. So it all starts with sensible policy making, and then it's about the operators on the ground not seeing it as being a fight with City Hall. It can't be. It needs to be how can we help you create the tourist mix that you want? What can we do to showcase these areas out of season, or what can we do to showcase this city which is 30 miles down the road? And a really great example of what you could do is a town like Margate, which I'm going to say you've been in the UK maybe 10, 12 years. Is that right? Or is it longer now?
It's about 8 years, yeah.
Yeah, okay, there you go. I had it, didn't I? 20 years ago, a town like Margate was seen as a very down at heel, a problem town with and I don't know how overblown it is. I'm not an expert, but, as in with drug problems and criminality and things of that nature. But hey, do you know what? It's 2 hours on the train to London, probably not even. And it's got an amazing beach, which the sun hits at sunset in a way that is more beautiful than anything else you'll probably see in the UK. I've got a picture on my phone, which we can maybe upload, which I'll show you. And the weather's fantastic. And what happened was they ran successful campaigns. They built an art gallery. They encouraged artists to come, and they built a community there that not only lives there, but then also has short-term rentals so that people can go and stay there as well. And what happens? It's self-fulfilling. Now you've got a whole community of people that live in Margate and only go to London 1-2 days a week, for example, and tourists really want to go there for the weekend. So you can build it. And again, I don't think people in Margate would say we've got too many tourists. Far from it. They want the tourists there because they want the town to develop economically. But clearly, if you reach a saturation point, you then have to have the other conversation where you have the hard conversation with people and go, well, okay, I think we now have enough hotels, enough lodges in the woods, enough urban short-term rentals. We now need to think about spreading it out. So it's two sides of the same coin. and I'm desperate to have that conversation, you will know that STAA are running a coastal town revival campaign, which I'm very passionate about. And there was a meetup in Blackpool. Blackpool's a great example. It's 1 hour on the train from Manchester. But how many trains are there? And like, could the train be half an hour? Probably. So let's build the infrastructure to get people out of Manchester city centre, which is booming, by the way, I'm not just saying this, it sounds like I'm being partisan as a Man United fan, but it's a booming city with property prices set to increase at their fastest rate of the entire UK. How do we get people out of that city for the weekend who've obviously, upwardly mobile, aspirational, young people working in central Manchester? How do we get them out to Blackpool to go and have a weekend with their mates? Should be easy, but you've got to build the infrastructure around it and then let the whole thing germinate so that they do want to come there. And it's not just, I'm flying to Spain. It's, every single time. I can see the joy in a weekend in Blackpool.
I love that example. And what I like about it as well is like there is this partnership between different parts of the city. It doesn't seem like there is just antagonism, which sometimes it can feel like in the larger cities. And another thing to really love about this industry, I think, is that there are so many entrepreneurs. Like everyone with an extra property can be an entrepreneur. And if given the right sort of circumstances and just like a little bit of shift in demand, you'll find people who see that and they will bring their properties out there and they will invest a little bit of money to make it nicer. And so I think it can very quickly change something compared to like more larger developments like large hotels, etc., with all of the planning processes. It can take a very long time. But short-term rentals, they can sort of almost like out of the grass in spring, right?
I agree. It's a mushroom industry, right? It's so easy. Your barrier to entry is virtually zero. Now, the double-edged sword there is the barrier entry is also virtually zero, which we know then causes issues. But I think it's unfair to demonize, let's say, Airbnb, because they're the market leader on the distribution side. It's unfair to demonize Airbnb and say all the profits are just going to Airbnb and they're sucking out of the country. Far from it. The vast majority of properties on Airbnb are managed by someone that just manages one listing. We know that. So we know that there are local entrepreneurs and people making their money from it, or it's allowing them to live the lifestyle they want, or it's providing them a second home in somewhere in rural Wales or the Cotswolds or Scotland that they and their family can use themselves, and they can make some money from them. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with someone making some side income from that on top of having that property? So we have to be really careful. But again, it all starts by not being combative, but realizing that we have the same goal. This might sound overly patriotic. I hope it doesn't, because I wouldn't say I'm a particularly patriotic person, but here we go. Maybe this will be patriotic. When I worked at One Fine Stay, one of the things I was proudest of was that we were bringing in Americans, in the most part, Americans to London, who would get their checkbooks out and start spending their dollars in central London. So, we were not taking things out of the UK economy, far from it. We were putting more in because we were putting money in the pockets of the hosts in central London and other cities around the world as it grew. But we were bringing in tourists who were then not just using Zone 1, they were also out in Zone 2, Zone 3, and all of the cafes and shops and pubs benefit from that. And again, it's not that your town's any beautiful if a tourist says it is, but it's going to help keep your town more beautiful if you can draw that tourist further out. So what I think was happening was the very, very wealthy tourists would go into Zone 1, and then the less wealthy, younger, would go into Zone 2. And again, what happens? Well, that's great. A good example is where we were both living at that one time, which was Stoke Newington. You could mention Stoke Newington to somebody in Sweden or somebody in Germany, and they've probably heard of it because they've probably looked at it on Airbnb as being an option that they could go and stay in themselves with their friends, like, or Brooklyn, or, there's different examples around the world. And these neighborhoods have really benefited from that. We have to be very careful, otherwise we do just keep it to a select group of hotels, and a lot of young people won't be able to afford to go and have a holiday in New York or London or Paris. And what does that do? Well, it means those cities become less dynamic. The art and the culture reflects that aging population, not that like young dynamic population that is really important as well. So again, just be careful what you wish for, because it might come true. But I know the counterbalance is when towns and cities feel like they're at capacity during the summer, there is a propensity to say, well, tourism is not the answer. But guys, what about shoulder season? How do we get people here in September, October? Guess what? Younger people who don't have kids are more likely to travel in shoulder season if you incentivize them to come. Build that marketing campaign, reduce your pricing, think about your town differently, because it is only, if we use the Barcelona example, it is only the Ramblas in July and August that is really, really overwhelming. The rest of the year, those businesses will probably enjoy the extra covers at their tables.
Yeah, it can truly be a win-win-win where, of course, if you zoom out really wide, like a couple of generations ago, people couldn't really travel. Like, and now it's something that isn't just for the wealthy. It's literally for everyone. And I think Ryanair has done a lot for, the sort of integration of Europe and probably beyond. But building that sort of backbone infrastructure is just a start. Like, there needs to be somewhere to absorb all of these more people that are traveling. And of course, it also provides them with a much more genuine experience if they can come to Stokey rather than spend all of the time on Regent Street. So in your role as Vice Chair at STAA, like, how do you see what we were talking about before in terms of Airbnb is a bit of a filter or like a quality assurance platform as well, if you will, for especially maybe the newer entrants, right? Like, if I'm going to One Fine Stay, I trust that wherever I'm staying will be fantastic. But I also sometimes want to stay with maybe a newer host or like a smaller property. And of course, like the value that the OTA provides to me as a guest is that I know that there's someone who has my back if something goes wrong, and I know there's like at least like some level of safety standards and that sort of thing, but it is relatively low. Do you see like a role there for sort of the councils between like getting too heavy-handed and having complicated licensing schemes and what the OTA can provide? Is there a gap, and how do we fill that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'll speak on it. And obviously I would say have a look at the STAA website. I'm not going to completely parrot what STAA think, but I guess as someone who's involved in STAA, I can give you my opinion. I'm in debates and conversations about it the whole time. I think it's really important that there is a registration scheme that needs to, I think, be quite light touch in its nature, because what that then allows us to do is understand the volume of short-term rentals and gives the consumer more protection against the product that they're having being subpar. Because that's, again, if you remember back to the start of this conversation, we said what we should all be obsessed with is making sure that low satisfaction scores are a thing of the past. That's our challenge the whole time. Tech-enabled hospitality where someone can make a booking at 3:00 in the morning when you're fast asleep and turn up the next morning, and you still need to deliver an A-class service to that person. It's challenging, right? That's challenging, but that has to be the aspiration. And that definitely starts with getting the right type of host who's professional. Now, being professional is doesn't matter how many listings you have. You can have one listing and be very, very professional. So let's be really clear about that. Every host should aspire to be a professional host, whether it's the 2 weeks a year when they leave Wimbledon because the tennis is on, or whether it's I've got 100 units and I'm managing it as a full-time job. It all starts there. And then I think the government should be looking to make sure that there is, say, just a light touch registration schemes, aware of it. And then you can add into that, reacting to what you see on the ground in terms of satisfaction scores. You work with OTAs and significant businesses in local areas to ensure that where there are holes, the government is suggesting ways that people can move to improve their properties. So it's just about having a conversation. I don't think it's about creating a huge checklist of things that make it impossible to rent. But I think it's about having a minimum standard. STAA is very, very passionate about that, minimum standard, so that people have a good experience, and then work hand in hand with policymakers to ensure that is met. And in the case of regulation in city centres, it's not based on the quality of the short-term regulation that's on. It's not a quality bar because, as you say, there is a filter on Airbnb because, if you complain to Airbnb, then they're looking at it centrally and they have the ability to delist that customer. Should we be aspiring for that to be like much more difficult to get going and renting? I don't think we should. But again, if you start with that registration scheme, that's going to allow you to know who's who and where the properties are. And I think that'd be a really good first step.
And maybe some minimum standards on guest safety and those kind of things.
I think that would come in the registration scheme, right? Just to make sure that it's at least a safe place. Because, that is ultimately think of it this way, we're both fathers, aren't we? So where would you want your kid, if, in 20 years when our kids are, oh my God, it's a terrifying thought, isn't it? I've no hair left. What's left of my hair will be gone. But my son and daughter are traveling the world. I want to know that when they're booking a short-term rental somewhere in the world, that there is that safety that, carbon monoxide checks and smoke detectors and things of that nature. So yeah, it's common sense really, isn't it?
I've totally become the dad that checks all the fire alarms before I check in an Airbnb, which I recommend everyone else doing as well, actually. The compliance rate is not what you want it to be.
Yeah, I agree with that. And of course, our industry friend, Simon Lehman, who we both know well, was telling a very potentially troubling story that worked out well for them, but how they woke up and a picture had fallen on their son in the night and the glass was all over him. So, it's that level of, if you are operating short-term rentals, you should be doing due diligence checks on what it is. You should stay in your properties as well and make sure that things look and feel right. Moving it away from safety and putting it back to just standards and experience. We all know there's nothing worse than checking into a short-term rental where there's no sharp knives. There's 3 plates for 6 people, which have been put as the 4 double-bedroom home can sleep 6 people, and now you've suddenly only got 3 plates. It's all of that is around auditing, checking, and being professional in how you approach what you do, and that is the key. If we're still doing this in 15 years' time, 20 years' time, again, I'll have no hair, my kids will be traveling around the world, but let's say we're back here in 20 years, that will still be the number one thing that everyone is talking about, is how do we ensure standards remotely?
And I think there are certain standards that a free market is really good at enforcing almost, right? Like you don't want to be in a short-term rental, as you say, like that doesn't have the basics. And if you don't have it, it'll show up in the first review and no one will really book that. I think when it comes to like what the market should do and what the regulation should do, we need to think about those events like Simon's event, which was, I think, picture frame fell on his son, right? So that's like a minimum safety standard that hasn't been met in that property, probably because it hasn't been audited. But it's also a bit of an outlier, right? Like it's an accident. It's something that doesn't happen every time. And I think when you're running an empire with 100 properties or 1,000 properties, you see these things every day, and you understand sort of what the 1% or a 0.1% event is. But when you're a smaller operator and you might only have the one listing, then these things become such outliers. And I think we as people, like, you buy insurance for your house because that's what you do, but you don't think about it the same way when you're traveling or when you're setting up your first short-term rental. So in my opinion, there are the things that the market does well, and then there are the things that the regulation can really like step in and help. And those are probably more on the fringes than the things that happen every weekend.
And I think that's fair. Yeah, I do. I think you're right. And it's why it is crucial that we're in the conversation, that we're networking with local policymakers. Like, I think that I live in Brighton now, and I think the local operators there do a great job of networking with the council leader, ensuring that they know that we're not trying to do the minimum. Far from it. We want our guests to be safe too. How can we work together? So dialogue is the most important thing. Seeing that, like, we are part of the tourist mix, and how can we ensure that, exactly as you say, the things that are happening in the fringes that aren't everyday occurrences there is a mechanism for ensuring that they're not happening continuously.
Was this also something that was on your mind when you decided to start Truvi? Of course, you operate in this very space.
So I met Humphrey Bowles, the wonderful Humphrey, who you know well, in 2011. We were both working together at One Fine Stay. And at that point, so, Humphrey's a sort of an entrepreneur born, so that was always coming up with ideas, always coming up with new businesses. We worked together in the acquisition team. So we ran the acquisition for London. He then left to start the first version of what we do now. And I carried on doing it for a bit longer and was looking after the team in Europe. During that time, for a time when we were young men, we were going door to door and signing up these properties to One Fine Stay, which now I find remarkable because the barrier to entry now is just non-existent, right? You click online and you build your listing and off you go. AI builds your listing and off you go. We were door to door around West Central London, going into people's houses, having a cup of tea and a biscuit, talking for an hour about our wonderful service, and then it would go back to our creative team at the office, who would then build a listing with lots of copy and content. So the whole process of onboarding someone was thousands and thousands of pounds, but there was a quality bar. Sure. So what that gave us an insight into was what would be the objections to why somebody wouldn't want to list their property with One Fine Stay, or more generally in the short-term rental space. So for years and years without realizing it. I was answering these questions every day for people, trying to make them feel comfortable. And Humphrey says this, but it's absolutely right. First thing people want to know is how much money they can make. The second thing they want to know is what happens if something goes wrong. And there's a twin approach there, which is one, you pick a short-term rental management company that has out-of-hours support and does checks, doesn't just try and do the minimum. And the second part of it is you need to have cast iron protection in place in case something happens. So when someone comes to stay at a short-term rental, we've heard it said, and you and I maybe have been guilty of saying it ourselves, but there's such a thing as holiday brain, where people don't want to engage with, the door is not opening on the first go, so I'm going to try and jack it with my shoulder. Unbelievable thought, but really not out of the realms of the type of damage that you might see. Or I'm drinking red wine from a mug at 10 o'clock in the morning, which isn't a non-holiday thing to do.
Well, I think your holidays are better than mine, Leo.
And that's just my kid. No, it's not my kid. And all of that leads to a unique set of problems. Someone is using your home for the first time, and they're probably using it in more of a consumer, I'm going to get the most out of this property versus, I'll be careful with my suitcase when I'm going up the stairs. So all of these things became a reality. So not only would we be pitching people and trying to handle these objections, but we'd also be dealing with what the reality of hosting would be versus the idea of hosting. So that gave us a very unique insight into what the challenges are. So now I feel like, in a way, what I do and what our company does is, through a product that we've built, which obviously does guest screening as well as protection, we're taking individual hosts and small property managers, large property managers through that process of going like, look, if you're new to this and you're starting, what you're really worried about is parties. Okay, great. Well, that's why you need to screen your guests. That's why you need to have a protection. But what you should be more worried about is the day-to-day scuffs and breaks and mistakes that someone might make because they're dancing on a table at 3 o'clock in the morning after going to a nightclub, right? That's real damage. This is how you deal with it. So for me, it was a very slow process that I meandered to it through what I was doing, because the number one reason that a short-term rental contract is ripped up, in my experience, is because a bad guest gets in and significant damage happens. And that's no good to anyone. Why is that no good to anyone? Because it's no good to the property manager, reputationally. You're not going to get a 5-star Google review on your website, which is what you need to pull someone into your direct booking website. You talked about it, social proofing. Nils is a great host. Nils is a great property manager. He's been looking after my home in Kensington really well. Thank you. Customer testimonial. I'm more likely to book that website because it looks like a trusted business. But also, it doesn't do any favors to us as an industry, because if you have a party in a flat, then suddenly all the other residents don't want short-term rentals happening in their flats anymore. So it's corrosive to growth of the industry. It's corrosive to growth of your company. And also, it continues the consumer behavior that actually, if you book a short-term rental, you can do what you want without any comeuppance. And so we feel very passionate, which is why I'm always been passionately involved in STAA. We're very passionate about the fact that we're not just trying to raise the standard of operators, but also raise the standard of what a guest perceives a short-term rental to be. And so my career is kind of, I guess, not purposefully, but has ended up with me in that situation. So we're far from just the fun police trying to stop parties, although that's an element of it. It's very much that we're trying to create an environment where you can safely transact. So a guest and a host can safely transact with one another, because there's been an initial due diligence check or some screening. And we know that if the worst happens and you accidentally leave the bathtub running and fall asleep and you ruin a really expensive floor, that there is also protection in place to ensure that, again, if you're hosting your own properties, if it's your own home, that you're not left short. And if you're managing on behalf of someone else, you're more likely to keep that contract. Because people say, I just tell my host to put it on their own insurance. They go, great. How's that going to go when some significant damage happens in a property? I can tell you, you're going to lose the business, you're going to lose the contract. So it's about, again, leveling up people's perceptions of what the industry is and also what you can do as a professional host.
It's great to see how the dots really connect throughout your journey, and how the experience you had at One Fine Stay really formed Truvi. How you've really tried to smoothen out those friction points. If we're turning to the future and we're looking 3 to 5 years ahead, one thing I feel is what you are alluding to here is the sort of balance between guest and host accountability. The expectations on the hosts are higher than ever, compared to when Airbnb was new and you maybe checked into someone's house and you expected there to be a bit of crumbles in the kitchen, and you didn't expect that super professional level. And now you do. But the expectations on the guest, I feel like, hasn't really changed. There isn't really that accountability that maybe you had before. Like, how do you see that evolving over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So let's remember that when we all started being Airbnb guests and Booking.com started doing short-term rentals, Vrbo was obviously a bit smaller in Europe at the time, so we probably had less exposure to that. But Vrbo, certainly home away if you're in the US, it was in the urban area and younger people generally. So it was like our demographic of people when we were in our early 20s, right? So you are less inclined to comment about the slightly faded kitchen. You don't even notice there was 3 plates. You didn't see it. You didn't see it because you were out getting dinner. You're just using it as a base, whatever it was. But my parents obviously had never stayed Airbnb. I'm sure your parents had never stayed Airbnb or Booking.com. So when they start using it, again, it does completely change the game. Marriott come in. You can suddenly use Bonvoy points to book a short-term rental. Wow, okay, well, there's got to be a really good set of standards that come alongside that. But you're right. The emphasis right now is all on the host to provide a service, and the guests can kind of say what they want. Is that to do with platform dynamics, potentially? All the OTAs most booking websites are not necessarily fixated on keeping their hosts loyal. They're very fixated on keeping their guests loyal to them. So you hear stories of certain booking platforms instantly taking the guest's word for it. So I do think that if what I think will happen to distribution happens over the next few years, which is that people start to be more planned about the type of guests that they want, and they're able to point their marketing in that direction, utilizing probably AI-based marketing tools to do that, and a really good direct booking website, you then do have more of an emphasis on, well, actually, this is the type of guest I want. I'm not just going to accept anyone. I'm going to accept this person at this price because I know they're more likely to look after my property, and I can get more people like that because they'll tell their friends and they'll share it on social media, and the flywheel effect happens. The guest will come. So for that reason, if that does occur, or in some way, shape or form that occurs, I think the guest does come into play as a feature. But while we're in this dynamic of OTAs dominating, I think the guest will always be able to control. Is that fair? What do you think?
I think you're right. As long as it is a guest going to Airbnb, right, and seeking out an Airbnb, they will forever be Airbnb's guests in a way, for better or worse. Whereas if you build up your own brand as a property manager and you manage to be a bit more selective about your guests and maybe build a relationship with the guests before they even stay, then I do think the dynamic changes, and maybe the behavior on the guest part will be a little bit more like you think about tenants today. Like if you think about long-term rentals, you have a very different dynamic, right? Like you go to see a place and you do it a little bit in competition with others, and you're trying to put your best foot forward. At least in London, the places I've lived, London, San Francisco, you really have to sell yourself because you know that the landlord has options. That dynamic is probably too much for like a holiday or for like a short-term rental. But I could see there being something in between the sort of instant booking that you get primarily, I guess, on Booking.com, where you just there's no relationship between the host and the guest. It's really just like, I booked this now and now I'm your guest. Whereas in the old days of Airbnb, there was like a conversation, right? And I feel like that this sort of like pendulum between the different extremes, it can certainly move. And now you're right, like it is very much like on, like the OTA is dominating how the guest journey is, and the property manager seldom manages to build a brand. But I could see that changes with the macro trends, where it's easier, like discoverability is easier. It's easier to find local entrepreneurs, local property managers. I could also see as platforms sort of mature that there's more direct bookings, right? There's more repeat bookings. And maybe you return to a place you've been before, whereas when a platform is new, almost everyone is visiting a place for the first time. But it's interesting. I like to think that there are a couple of younger entrepreneurs thinking about these problems who come up with some new ideas in the next few years.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's maybe about like circles, communities. So we've talked about home swapping as being another version of that. So you don't necessarily swap, but you get credit for another trip. So it's not a direct swap, sorry, it's sometimes asynchronous, which kind of gets around regulations, but also it's this idea of community, traveling within your tribe, staying with someone who's like-minded. I often hear people say, as Airbnb specifically has got bigger, it's lost that, which I think is a fair. I think probably even Brian Chesky would say the same thing if he's honest with himself about it, which is fine. So I think you're right, and I think if it feels more like a peer-to-peer exchange, you're more forgiving of these things. So as distribution changes, and it is right open for change right now. That will be the pendulum swing that puts it back into that bucket. And again, it's like, well, if you're the active local host, doing everything professionally, seeking new channels of distribution that you think work for you, actually, there could be a world where you decide to turn off a certain OTA because you are getting guests that you don't like, and your reliance on that OTA is lessened by the work that you've done, such that the idea of turning it off is not inconceivable. Whereas in today's world, I would suggest it is inconceivable that you would turn off any of the big OTAs as a property manager.
It's been so great, Leo. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think there were some really interesting insights here, like between regulation, what the market does, what local council does, and sort of seeing this industry as a force for good in communities in the UK. So I really like that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nils.
Thank you for listening to Minute by Minute. If today's episode gave you fresh insight, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Share this episode with your team and follow us on social media to continue the conversation and exchange your own operational stories. To learn more about privacy-first property protection, visit minut.com. Until next time, make every minute count to maintain your property's safety.